So hello, great pleasure to be here today among all these fantastic speakers. So when Monica first approached me about this conference and I learned about the very sort of modest subject matter of the day, I immediately, perhaps out of nervousness, began to think about a kind of detour through the past, and more specifically through the past of the future. And consider the way in which speculation regarding the future has typically been cast in terms of extremes, of kind of singular trajectories and totalizing logics. Corresponding to kind of dominant cultural preconceptions, these narratives construct the future in ways that inevitably privilege certain trajectories over others, in a way that tends to elide the kind of plurality of forces, effects, and influences that inevitably coexist in the transformation of material culture. These projections also tend to conceive of the future in the terms of the present that produced it, as in this case of a 19th century version of a roofed city for the year 2000, complete with horses and trolleys below. And in this way, speculative futures of the last century, the 20th century can be read in terms of larger narratives of scientific advance and technological progress that characterize modernity. And they also tend to carry these storylines to a kind of final deterministic extreme, such as the sort of human expansion to the lunar surface or the ocean floor. These past futures also tend towards myths of progress or decline, extremes of the apocalyptic or the utopian. So on the one hand, the sort of techno-agrarian paradise of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, then the sort of more recent post-consumerist dystopia of Pixar's eco-fable WALL-E. The question then becomes, is it possible to conceive of a more complex or sort of nuanced reading of the future, to think about the ways in which technologies often function or malfunction in unpredictable ways and generate unanticipated social effects? They can be co-opted and misappropriated, as in this case of segways functioning as perhaps the world's most unlikely urban assault vehicles. And rather than a kind of this will kill that mentality, new technologies tend to coexist with older forms. And in fact, in many cases, they tend to appropriate the very syntaxes of established syntaxes as their own. In this case, for instance, of the sort of post-war single-family bomb shelter, the conventions of the suburban domestic interior were used in a way to kind of normalize the unfathomable prospect of nuclear war, to kind of produce it as a kind of digestible aspect of everyday life through design. So the result is this kind of paradoxical hybrid always, a kind of coexistence of the radically new and the kind of deeply conventional. So what I wanted to sort of raise here as a kind of question is not what the form of the future will take per se, but rather, is it possible to develop a mode of practice and working that would embrace this kind of contingent and contradictory aspect of future projection? In other words, can we sort of avoid the dominant mythologies, let's say, of our own time, and instead operate in ways that opportunistically and even optimistically embrace paradox as a kind of productive catalyst? So quickly, since we're ultimately architects, I wanted to talk about a series of projects which seek to exploit precisely this tension between the emerging and the existent. These projects engage a series of issues which could be seen as sort of broadly characterizing design practice today, from the impacts of environmental sustainability to globalization to digital production. But in each case, they attempt to kind of tease out sort of latent possibilities within the apparent constraints and contradictions of the specifics of the problem. So the first project is called Park Tower, and examines the combination of a sort of new and more sustainable form of personal automobility, electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, with a kind of cliched form, this kind of very known form of the switchback parking ramp, transforming the single spiral of the conventional parking garage into a kind of double helix that intertwines parking and program to generate an 80-story drive-up skyscraper, in which the car is no longer relegated to the ground plane or the lower floors of the building, but in fact intertwined into every level, without the detrimental effects of noxious fumes associated with fossil fuel vehicles. The shifting requirements then for parking density associated with each of the stacked multi-use programs generate the spatial logic of the tower, and in each vertical segment, the sectional relationships between cars and program are exploited to generate new effects and new possibilities. As a result, at the kind of uppermost level of the tower, a vertical neighborhood combines the amenities of suburban dwelling, complete with driveways, front lawns, and visual access to one's neighbor, with the panoramic pleasures of high-rise living. Conversely, in this project entitled New Suburbanism, we are interested in how two apparently outmoded formats, two known formats, in this case the suburban mini mansion and the big box store, could be sectionally recombined to produce a kind of new hybrid typology. The houses migrate to occupy the excessive horizontal roofscapes of the big box stores, generating a kind of vertical coupling of retail and domestic environments that produces new efficiencies of infrastructure, land use, and transportation while maintaining the independent logics of both house and store. Another project for Hudson Square in New York, which is an area on the west side of Manhattan. What was interesting to us about this project was the way that we actually found within the existing fabric the kind of residues of two previous notions of the future. In other words, two future projections of a kind of urban system. One, the 1811 Commissioner's grid of Manhattan, and the other, the sort of 20th century notion of the superblock. So the project existed by engaging two multi-block structures, these sort of massive buildings, which in fact kind of interrupted the east-west street grid of the surrounding neighborhoods, separating it from the waterfront. The notion of the design then was to extend the sort of linear trajectory of the street grid over the roofs of these architectural monoliths to form a series of elevated housing bridges, which would produce a kind of new three-dimensional urbanism, which literally piggybacks onto the existing fabric. Acting as a kind of inversion of the street, these linear structures would sponsor a series of cantilevered housing units, which would shift in section and orientation to maximize solar exposure and to assure that everyone had a waterfront view. At the same time, the kind of roofs, these sort of massive horizontal surfaces of the superblocks would become a kind of surrogate landscape, incorporating parks and agriculture to sustain these new species of roof-dwelling inhabitants. A very different project here, which addressed a kind of context which could only kind of occur in the sort of current environment of, let's say, global exchange and media oversaturation. A project in which 100 architects from around the world were brought by these two gentlemen, the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei and the client Sai Jiang, from literally every continent in the world to Beijing, to the People's Republic of China, and ultimately to Inner Mongolia. Each of the architects was then commissioned to produce a design for a 10,000 square foot villa for a new cultural development near the regional capital of Ordos. So this was the kind of site plan is given. This was actually our site as we found it in the drawings. And this was the reality of the site as we found it, a kind of sort of astonishing sort of desert landscape, literally on the edge of the Gobi Desert with, at this point, very little there, the beginnings of infrastructure perhaps. And then this sort of surreal moment where 100 architects from around the world, inevitably clad in black, sort of descend upon this landscape and sort of walk out into this kind of Lawrence Arabia sort of scenery. Everybody kind of trying to figure out where their site is within this sort of context. And then maybe even stranger, those same 100 architects sequestered in, believe it or not, a Holiday Inn in the middle of Inner Mongolia. And the sort of result of 100 ambitious, talented architects all vying to kind of create a unique architectural proposal in this sort of highly confined environment. So what you get is a kind of architectural petting zoo, perhaps, where kind of radically different species are penned sort of cheek to jowl with one another. So how does one then produce a house in this kind of environment? So in response to the kind of double site of the project, the real site of the desert, and the project, the kind of constructed side of the project as a kind of media event, our design developed a kind of split personality, a kind of intentional schizophrenia which allowed it to be both extrovert and introvert. Divided sectionally, the house expands at the ground floor and contracts on the second, with the more public ground floor programs defined by materially specific walls that would extend into the surrounding landscape to enclose a series of courtyards, and then move upward to pierce the second floor block of private rooms. This split personality would then be maintained by an 18-inch sort of glass clear story slot, which allowed the kind of brick solid to float above these sort of site-based concrete walls. And the interior spaces would be extended to the controlled exteriors of the courtyards in a way that allowed for domestic intimacy to be preserved, while allowing a kind of contact with the climate and frame views of the desert sky. And then finally, and I probably went much faster than I thought I would, a project for Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, where we were asked to actually perform as, in a way, installation artists, looking at this kind of wall in a disused portion of a lobby within a building by SOM. And the contradiction here, the sort of paradox that was engaged, was the relationship between, I would say, computation and craft, between the digital and the physical, and how a project needs to sort of negotiate between these different, let's say, on one hand, a kind of emergent technology with kind of older forms of making. So here, a project developed in relation to the very idea of vision, where a series of visual trajectories based on the movement of users through the building lobby became a kind of complex geometry of overlapping view cones, which intersected a thickened wall, which really constituted our site. Ultimately, the most fascinating thing here, however, became the translation of a geometry that was generated digitally into a kind of buildable material artifact, where the necessities of manufacture gave rise to unexpected conditions and new possibilities. So for instance, the sort of logistics of transportation and manufacture required that this sort of enormous wall be broken down into approximately 360 steel cubes, each of which was actually manipulated individually to sort of eliminate a lot of the sort of structural problems that were inherent in each piece, and then fabricated individually with this sort of custom pneumatic jig, with computer-cut panels, which were then crafted, welded, and finished by hand. So the kind of surprise here was that, in a way, the kind of most sort of effective, compelling, and provocative aspects of the final design were, in fact, the kind of collisions, contradictions, and assimilations that had to be made between two radically different systems of making and thinking about architecture. And that's it. Thank you.